Millions across Spain, Portugal and parts of France have been left without power today after a massive outage. Spain's declared a national emergency after the blackout, which brought life to a standstill in many parts of the country, including the capital, Madrid. Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez said a strong oscillation in the European grid was behind the outage, but the cause was still being determined. Portugal's National Cybersecurity Centre says there's no sign of a cyber attack.
The streets of cities across Spain and Portugal were plunged into chaos as traffic lights went out and public transport ground to a halt. Authorities urged the public not to call an ambulance unless it's a real emergency. Phone networks have been down, payment transactions halted and ATMs shut down. Shops were plunged into darkness. Freezers and refrigerators went off in supermarkets. Many stores closed, while others kept going, although not always by choice.
We can't pull down the shops gate as there's no power. We're just going to have to see what happens, like all the stores.
Metro stations in Madrid and other cities were forced to close, and long-distance trains were also cancelled, leaving passengers stranded, like here in Malaga. Many airports and hospitals have managed to keep working, thanks to backup generators. But for staff, it's a struggle to get to work.
I have an afternoon shift at the hospital, but I have to see. Maybe there are buses. If not, there's nothing.
Supermarkets with generators were inundated with customers panic buying, not knowing when the power might come back on. In some places, bottled water sold out within hours.
I feel very overwhelmed, even scared, because we don't know what's going on. We can't call, we can't text, nothing. I'm scared, honestly. Let's see what happens.
The Madrid Tennis Open was forced to suspend play. Spectators had to make their way out of the complex in almost complete darkness. US tennis star Coco Gauff had her on-court interview cut off as microphones went dead. It's a similar story in neighbouring Portugal. Empty train stations and crowded streets. Even as power was restored to some parts of the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal's grid operator said it could take up to a week to repair damage to the nation's electricity grid.
Well, imagine you're sitting at home watching TV and all of a sudden the screen goes blank and all the lights go out. You wait for the power to return, but nothing happens. The longer you sit in the dark, the more you start thinking about how dependent you are on electricity. Without power, you can't keep the food in the fridge and the freezer cold. And how would you even cook the food or make a hot coffee? How will you charge your smartphone when the power battery runs out? And what's happening outside? How is society going to function without electricity? What will power the hospitals, the supermarkets, the petrol stations? You begin to worry, so it's a massive relief when the lights finally go back on. Well, we're massively relieved to be able to talk to Benjamin Sovacool. He's a professor of energy policy at the University of Sussex Business School in the UK. Welcome to DW, Professor. We'll get to all of that in just a sec, but we've heard from the Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez blaming what he called anomalous oscillations in high voltage power lines in Spain for this outage. Can you clue us in as to what that might mean?
Somewhat. Obviously, transparency over what causes electricity blackouts isn't always very high because there are legitimate concerns about malicious attacks on the grid.
Right.
But I can tell you from data that we have kind of talks about how about 87% of power outages are caused by weather or natural disasters. But there is a surprising 12% are caused by system inadequacy. So it's basically grids that just need upgraded, grids that are using old technology or perhaps not really strong digital controls that just fail. And then the remaining percentage of blackouts, about 2%, are actually caused by intentional or malicious attacks or interference by third-party stakeholders.
OK, so but we have this thing zapping out the grid in 3 countries. So does that mean that they're interconnected in some way?
Absolutely. So, believe it or not, most countries in Europe, and indeed even states in the United States, are interconnected into different grids. And the European grid consists of a number of different grid operators. That's why the Portuguese grid operator is talking the Spanish grid operator. You even have those like Nord Pool, which manage power in the Nordic countries. The European grid is more integrated than the United States grid. You even have states like Texas, which has its own grid called ERCOT, which makes it very vulnerable to disruptions like the winter storm that caused a massive blackout and even deaths in Texas a few years ago. And so, yeah, the grids are meant to be interconnected so you can kind of balance power, trade electricity. You can get German solar energy down into the south. You can get maybe hydroelectricity from Norway that helps feed into the UK or Germany. But it also comes with risks because the more you interconnect these grids, the more that these types of blackouts can cascade. So a single blackout can affect many more.
So let's talk about resilience and maintenance then. Where would you be looking for a culprit in this?
I know they haven't yet pinpointed it yet, and it sounds like the Prime Minister isn't yet sure. But there are, at least fortuitously, 3 different things that we can do to improve grid resilience, and they're at 3 different scales. So the first thing we can do is really invest in energy efficiency. Energy efficiency tends to have not only co-benefits for avoided emissions and jobs and resilience, but it also makes the grid more stable and more secure because you're using energy a lot more strategically than you would have been otherwise. And we've actually saved more energy through energy efficiency efforts in Europe than any single source of energy supply since the 1970s. The second intervention is to invest in grids. They don't sound very attractive. You want to invest in energy supply or maybe energy storage or other things like solar and wind, and the grid is perpetually uninvested in or underinvested in. And it isn't just the transmission grid, also local distribution grids. And even though it's 2025, you still have situations where people go to charge their Tesla and they cause a grid outage because those distribution grids just aren't up to par. And lastly, and I'm a huge proponent of this, is invest in energy supply that is more distributed. We call this distributed generation or prosuming, where you put solar panels, wind, hydro, biogas, and other interventions close to your home or your factory or your hospital or your building.
Tell me then, give me your thoughts then on what you've seen today. We've seen shops shut and trains halted and the internet, heavens above, the internet cut off. Are you, when you see all that happening, are you looking at that and saying, well, that's okay because this happened and this happened? Or are you looking at that and saying, no, this is all appalling, we haven't done enough of this, that or the other?
I think a bit of both. On the one hand, you know, these grid outages do occur a lot. I mean, I was looking at data before today's talk, and there have been major power outages in highly industrialized countries like those in Europe that have affected more than 2 billion people going over the past 20 years. And this isn't just places like Spain and Portugal. It's California, Texas, Switzerland, Austria, Brazil. There's even a massive one in northern India that affected almost 700 million people for almost a day, which, as you say, closes shops, hurts the ability to pump water, means there's no refrigeration for vaccines, and so forth. So, and who pays for these outages? We usually do as consumers, right? We pay through lost product, or we pay because we just aren't able to access those services. And that also may be why the blackouts are allowed to continue. I mean, even in the United States, the Department of Energy is estimating $150 billion a year is lost to power outages that American businesses pay for. So I think that also underscores why it's more normal. Electricity is now far more ubiquitous for our transport systems. As you say, it can do so much. We don't have usually coal stoves or wood stoves anymore. It's heat pumps. We no longer have, other forms of, fossil energy. Even in places like Denmark, it's now mostly electric heat. So I think this switch towards electrification also is part of the problem because it's putting more strain on grids, but also it's a good thing because the grid, electricity, is much lower carbon than these energy sources, and we're talking about electrifying even more. So we further electrify industry and bring online other homes and get them off of things like fossil fuels, natural gas, and so forth. So I think, unfortunately, it's kind of a hidden, normalized cost of electricity today.
All right, we have to, that's direction of travel towards greater electrification. That's irreversible, you believe. We don't need to be looking anywhere else for any other power source. We just need to do this better. Yes,
I would say that is a very nice, succinct way of capturing my opinion.
OK, so until we do this better, because most of the world in the middle of a cost of living crisis, everything costs more. And as you say, infrastructure not particularly sexy. Are we looking at more of this happening more often?
Absolutely. So the two metrics people often use to measure power outages are frequency and duration. Kind of frequency is how often they happen. Duration is how intensive they are. Do they last for an hour or a minute or days or weeks? And unfortunately, we're seeing increases in both the frequency and duration of blackouts. And climate change is actually aggravating both of them as well. The hotter it gets, and the more severe storms there are, the more severe wind events there are, the harder it is for electricity networks to deliver kilowatt hours or electrons to your home. And those are set to get almost twice as worse in the next 15 years, and potentially 3 times as worse by the end of the century. So I think we have this perfect storm brewing of we need electrification to solve climate change, but climate change is only making electricity systems far more vulnerable to disruption.
And so philosophically then, as we use electricity to solve so many of our problems, and of course the internet, well, what happens when those two things aren't available anymore?
Well, hopefully we'll continue to invest in energy efficiency and build sources of energy supply. And maybe the solution isn't always the grid. Maybe it is microgrids and mini grids. And by the way, many different communities already have these today so that if the big grid goes down, they can still provide internet services, health services, electricity services, and so forth. And I also think there's a strong push towards, like I said, decentralizing power supply to homes and businesses, because they're not only more resilient, they generate cost savings for you, and they're more reliable because you don't have to rely on a huge brittle transmission infrastructure because it's generated right in your house, on your roof, which is far more closer and minimizes other things like transmission losses, by the way. The average transmission system loses about 6 to 10% of its electricity getting that kilowatt hour to your house.
And so also, let's remain philosophical. This didn't happen this time, as far as I know, but when the power goes out, we often see the looters come out, and it makes you think, well, is electricity the sort of the fine line between civilization and chaos?
Absolutely. And I have sociologists and other colleagues of mine that kind of talk about society can survive about 24 hours without reliable electricity until we really start to see forms of anarchy and even violent civil disobedience occur. And there's a cause and effect there as well. Sometimes these acts of violence can cause electricity networks to go down. In other situations, once they go down, they then incentivize people to loot or shop, etc. Also made true with electric security systems and all these smart home devices, your Ring camera, your automated locks, which run this really tenuous risk of either they lock you in or out of your house, or they let anyone have access. So it's really difficult to get it right about the level of digitalization and electrification that we really want for our homes, at least if we don't have backup sources of power.
I think between us, we've just come up with a great idea for a video game. Professor Benjamin Sovacool from the University of Sussex. Thank you so much.